Welcome to today's talk. My name is Joseph Giacomin, and today I'm going to be discussing a topic, design naming, the design naming of our product, system, or service, a topic that has become somewhat more important and more relevant in recent years. So first of all, what do we mean by a name? Dictionaries suggest it's a word or a group of words by which something is referred to, something is pointed to, it's associated with it. It's something that we use to think about that object or that person or that phenomenon. And the important part is it carries associations and it carries connotations with it. Properties come with the name. Typical example of connotations and associations: two automobiles designed and produced 50 years apart, carrying the same name. And the same name is carried over to indicate certain properties, certain connotations, certain associations, which help us to understand immediately the product. You can look at the aesthetics, the functionality, the consumer segment that the vehicle's targeted at, and you can see very clearly how, despite the many differences and the time period, the long period of time that's passed since the original, you can see that some of those properties are carried over, and the name is carried over to maintain those associations, connotations, and characteristics. Names are very important because they affect our interpretation of things. Until we meet something or somebody and explore it and come to know it well, just the name it's carrying may tell us a lot about it, particularly at the moment of first contact. Typical example in this slide, a study done at a university with a large number of people, looking at what do people think might be the properties or the characteristics of a person just based on the name. So before we've met the person, what might the person's name be telling us? And if you look at the slide, you see the analysis, and people have certain stereotypes or expectations or even prejudices already on the name. So when we meet these people, we may be proved incorrect and we may change our opinion with time, but the name has brought with us at the moment of first contact certain expectations. And this is particularly important with respect to things like automation and various products of design. Names affect the interactions that people have with the artifacts, with the product, system, services we're designing. For example, with automation, here's one typical example, many can be cited: giving a machine a more machine-like or numerical or very scientific name, as opposed to giving it a more human-like or anthropomorphic or zoomorphic name, you end up that the people are treating it differently. In this case, a hospital medicine delivery robot got treated much better from the hospital staff when it had a human-like name. People weren't so critical of the machine, whereas when it was a more machine-like name, they were very severe when the machine malfunctioned. And names will affect people's behavior. It's well known, well documented. Many research studies look at how the naming of foods and beverages might change our consumption patterns and thus also indirectly our health. One study being cited here in this example, simply changing the name of a given food product without changing any other property of the food product made very important changes to people's opinions about that food product after tasting it and trying it out, and very important differences in the amount they consumed of that food product. So naming has important implications for behavior, consumer behavior particularly. Names have been, since they're important, they've been studied, they've been looked at for some time now. And there's been a number of studies looking at the naming of farm animals and animals in antiquity and in ancient societies, looking at more recently how people have named artifacts, machines, things that we've invented and we've built, typically locomotives, automobiles, aircraft, factory machinery. And a number of studies have converged to what some would refer to as a general law of name development. And what's been noted is that when something new has been invented, initially the names given to these products tend to be more descriptive, to carry what's referred to as essential characteristics. They somehow help people to become more familiar with this very new thing that is presenting itself in society. So if we look at, for example, English locomotives, the early ones had names like Rocket or Flying Scotsman, which give you an idea or suggest things like speed, things like power. In the case of Flying Scotsman, the high speed of this particular train and the route it was running between Scotland and England. So names in the early days with most machines and most human artifacts have been found to be very descriptive. The general law of name development, however, suggests that as time passes and people have become more familiar with these particular artifacts, quite often the naming diverges from the original technical, scientific, helpful descriptions, and it goes away from these essential characteristics and it becomes more commemorative, more opportunistic. We name the things in a slightly more random, more societal manner, naming it after famous people, famous events, things that are of importance and value in society. For example, trains in the middle 20th century, UK locomotives in the middle 20th century, had many commemorative names, such as Battle of Britain, Britannia, and so forth. And these names, despite being very interesting and very emotionally engaging and attracting attention to the service, clearly these names are no longer so connected to the characteristics of the artifact itself. And if the naming process historically has been found by many researchers to have this sort of trajectory, in beginning with helpful descriptions and quite often later becoming more commemorative and more societal in nature, the next question would be, okay, if I've designed something and I'm clear whether it's completely disruptive and new or whether it's something more incremental and more familiar so I know where I am on the naming trajectory, there's then the question of what criteria can I deploy as a designer? What things can I think about to help me choose amongst the better names for this particular opportunity I'm designing? Now, one approach, sometimes helpful, is based on information theory. It was noted already in the 20th century that information theory, which quantifies numerically how much useful information or how many new characteristics and new items of information are associated with a given word or a given phrase, information theory can be applied to naming. And the basic logic is information says the information we find in a given word, in a given language, is proportional to the logarithm of 1 over the probability of encountering that word in that language. So a word that's very strange and rare, such as supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, is telling us a lot more and carrying a lot more information than a very familiar, frequent word, such as the, which appears in many phrases, in many contexts, in many places, and thus is not so specific as supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. So information theory can provide us, from a corpus of language, the ability to actually calculate. And it would suggest that words that are a little bit more rare in a given language might be more attention-grabbing, and they might be a little bit more memorable to people because they're carrying more information than the more frequent, the more common words that we use every day. And information theory seems to capture a lot of what we see in everyday life. For example, lots of products, lots of systems and services these days will have a letter X somewhere in the name or at the end of the name or at the beginning of the name, such as the Xbox game box above. And the letter X is statistically amongst the letters that's used in less words in the English language. So X is rather rare, its probability is rather small. 1 over the probability thus becomes very big, and the information the X is carrying is very big. So information theory seems to suggest if something word or letter or combination of letters or phrase is very rare, it will be more memorable, more meaningful, carry more information. And it does look like lots of designers are tuning in to this fact and using it in the naming of their products. Another approach to naming, again, knowing where we are on the trajectory from early days to later days, if we're looking for a particularly effective, particularly efficient, particularly special word or phrase to name our product, system, or service, another approach is sound symbolism. Sound symbolism is the idea or the concept or the discipline which suggests that not all words in a given language have a sound which is arbitrary. There tends to be, for many words, in many circumstances, a direct correlation or connection between what the word sounds like and what it's referring to or what it means. Typical example is the Kiki Buloba paradigm, which has been demonstrated in many languages, more than 70, if I recall correctly, across the world. In most cases, when you ask a person which of these two shapes is the Kiki and which is the Buloba, in more than 70% of the people would say that would correctly identify the spiky, sharp one as the Kiki and the rounded, more gentle one as the Buoba. And this is because prospected, suggested, the explanation tends to be presented as the mouth has to move differently and form its shape differently depending on whether we have the sharp sounds of the K and the I or the more rounded, gentle, harmonic sounds of the U, the O, and the A. So people are associating the sound with the shape that they're referring to. So this Kiki Buoba effect has been noted on many occasions in most languages, and it's very systematic and very strong in most people. And it's one example of the many, many words in language which have similarities in their sound with respect to the action or possibly the characteristics which the product or the artifact exhibits. And sound symbolism is one naming approach which has become very popular over the last 20 years and has been lots of research done, and it's been shown that choosing the right combination of letters or the right words, we can make a name sound bigger or smaller. We can make it sound faster or slower, comfortable, dependable. We can change what the direct, immediate perception people have of something by choosing appropriately the letters to make the sounds which push the psychological interpretation in that direction. And it's been applied quite often also in the branding domain, and it's been looked at on many occasions in many studies, how, for example, automotive manufacturers are using sharp, hard sounds in their names, such as Jaguar and Corvette and Porsche, emphasizing the power and the strength and the abilities and the road holding of their vehicles. In other cases, it's been noted that things like hotel chains, where we go to sleep at night and we hope to have a pleasant experience and a good rest, how they quite often have more harmonic sounds in their names in the more successful hotel chains. So looking at how sharp or how rounded and harmonic the sounds are, and accepting sound symbolism as a representative, a possible interpretation of how people psychologically react to words and names, it's possible to fine-tune your name selection by trying to match your product characteristics with your sound characteristics. And a particularly interesting case, one that's keeping me very busy all the time these days, is that of automation and robotics. Because automation and robotics are types of machines. They're machines, products we invent as human beings, which are very complex. They have some mechanical characteristics, some very simple physical properties, and they also have many more lifelike and more human-like characteristics about their motion and their sounds. And some of them speak to us like Siri and Cortana these days. So automation and robots are very interesting to look at the names and see what's working and not working in terms of the naming of these devices. One researcher, Kay, analyzed the names of robots that he found on the internet on more than 100 robot competitions across the world. And it was very interesting. This database of names taken off the internet, taken from these competitions, suggested that more than 2/3 of the names from these 100 competitions were very biomorphic or lifelike attributes. They sounded like people or animals. They tended to be less functional and more behavioral in nature, probably reflecting the more lifelike, more human characteristics of these machines, which are very complex in their operation and perform many, many different tasks. The naming of the automated systems that Kay noticed in his database, it was also interesting that there was very evident gendering. Those robots that were designed for purposes which stereotypically, traditionally, historically have been associated more with the work of males had more male names. And those robots, perhaps in a nursing context, in a hospital context, a secretarial or assistant context, that were more traditionally associated historically in our society with the work of females, they were named, those robots, more with female names. So good or bad, this currently quite a bit of gendering occurring in the names we're giving to our automation, whether it's a driving navigator in an automobile or a robot in a factory or a hospital setting. We are looking at choosing names quite often which represent the tradition as opposed to what possibly the machine might be able to offer on its own these days. And another interesting characteristic, possibly the most interesting characteristic in Kay's database, was that the naming of robots quite often demonstrates or exhibits a characteristic of hybridicity. Many of the names were very mechanical. They sounded machine-like, factory-like in nature. Many of the other names were more human. They were human or animal type names that we tend to use in our society. But a large number of the names, this is the interesting part, were actually hybrids. They contained both a more mechanical component and also a more human or anthropomorphic component brought together into the same name, possibly chosen by the robot's designers to emphasize the fact that the machine is capable or has many purely traditional mechanical characteristics, but at the same time also exhibits a complexity of behavior and a complexity of functions it can perform, which is more typical perhaps of an animal or a human being. So hybridicity, a mixture of the mechanical and the human, the cyborg, is very common in the naming of many of the automations and machines that we're designing today. And finally, just as a possible recommendation or consideration, if this is the case, that the naming seems to be for these complex automated machines, the naming seems to be used to give an idea still today of the essential characteristics of what the machine's about and what it can do. Well, if we're still in that phase, then it might be worth considering that we can use the name to emphasize the market segmentation, the product design specification, the objectives and aims of that particular robot or that particular automation. By using names such as box or connector or cube or mover or pod or shuttle or transporter, we are clearly giving it a more mechanical, point-to-point, repetitive, simple connotation or association. We're trying to say with the name that the machine has a very specific set of functions, and it's probably limited in its capability to go outside of that domain. If instead, as a designer, And we see this with Siri and Cortana and many automations which we're showing up on our computers and in our automated assistants these days. If instead we give it a name such as agent or assistant or doctor or guide or entertainer or specialist or valet, we are clearly pushing the interpretation as the designers of the artifact. We're pushing the customers or the user's interpretation more in the direction of expecting more complex and more types of responses and more capabilities from the machine, because we're pushing in the direction of looking at it more as not so much what a machine would furnish, but perhaps more as what a human being would typically traditionally be furnishing to us as a service in that particular situation. So that's just a few observations about how a name with its connotations and associations might help to, at least at the time of first contact, establish expectations and connotations, associations in the minds of the users or the customers. Thank you very much for your time and your patience with this material. I hope there was something useful to you in all that. We'll be continuing with these talks onwards with further discussions of things designers can do to affect or shape the interactions with the people. Thank you very much. Goodbye.